Zay Barnwell of Sweet Honey in the Rock once taught a group of UU ministers that song. She, Unitarian herself, member of the All Souls congregation in Washington, D.C. My mom, Laurel, and I took that class with her, and she explained that in this song there is a profound theology, not the theology that we get tripped up on about Jesus dying for everyone, but the theology that the balm, the source of healing and grace and goodness that will make the wounded whole, that will bring back dignity and life and heal the wounds of those who have suffered the oppressions of empire, who have been downtrodden by our society. That same balm is the balm that will heal the sin-sick soul, will heal the souls of those who have benefited, who have reaped the harvest of the oppression others have suffered. That in that balm, in that healing balm, both the wounded will be made whole and the sin-sick souls will be saved. And of course, the song and the tradition that it comes out of names Jesus as that balm, but we know that that is only one way of knowing that balm has emerged over and over again throughout history in every moment where people have come together to practice love in a way that makes justice real. And of course, that's the life project of the man who we honor this weekend, who was so inspired and influenced by Gandhi and by Thoreau, who had inspired him. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And so we're weaving this web, weaving this tapestry of our own community. I know a few folks started bringing in pieces of fabric, clothes this morning. I invite you to do so. The rest of the month we'll be gathering them. Craig has brought an ingenious tool for cutting them up. So thank you, Craig, and Meter out there for cutting up and weaving together this garment of destiny that we're making here. But that quote, of course, that famous quote that I imagine everyone in this room has heard probably countless times, it comes from the letter from the Birmingham jail. You might have known that. The letter that was written to white clergy, 8 white clergy men who had protested Dr. King and the civil rights movement use of civil disobedience as a tactic, who had criticized them and said, in essence, be patient. In that letter, Dr. King outlined his theology of nonviolence. He explained through the canon of Judeo-Christian ethics how to determine whether a law is just or unjust. So I want to read you just a passage of that. It's a long letter, but worth repeating a passage as we remember him today. He told them, "You express a great deal of anxiety over our willingness to break laws. This is certainly a legitimate concern, since we so diligently urge people to obey the Supreme Court's decision of 1954 outlawing segregation in the public schools. It is rather strange and paradoxical to find us consciously breaking laws. One may well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? He says the answer is found in the fact that there are two types of laws. There are just laws and there are unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. Now, what is the difference between the two, he asks. How does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal and natural law. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. All segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority, that sin-sick soul, and the segregated a false sense of inferiority. To use the words of Martin Buber, the great Jewish philosopher, segregation substitutes an I-it relationship for the I-thou relationship and ends up relegating persons to the status of things. So segregation is not only politically, economically, and sociologically unsound, but it is morally wrong and sinful. Paul Tillich, he quotes, said that sin is separation. Isn't segregation an existential expression of man's tragic separation, an expression of his awful estrangement, his terrible sinfulness? So, he ends that section, so I can urge men to obey the 1954 decision of the Supreme Court because it is morally right. And I can urge them to disobey segregation ordinance because they are morally wrong. And of course, he goes on in the letter to indict famously the white liberal who urges patience as a greater barrier to progress than the KKK member who openly spews hate. And since I first read that letter in high school, I've carried some weight of that indictment. I don't know about you all, but it was troubling to discover that I was part of an inheritance of racism, that my own life played into that dynamic of oppression. The weight of the indictment to realize that to have white skin in this country is to be in constant danger of living in complicity with evil. Can you first remember when you became aware of racism? I wonder, for those of us who are white, do you have a memory of a time when you found yourself accused, either by someone else or by your own conscience, of participating in racism? I invite you to just remember what that felt like in your body, the sensations of it. I remember, heat. One time, it was so overwhelming, I ran out the room of a meeting that I had been facilitating and sobbed for an hour. I believe that the true self, the self we were talking about last week, that sense of intact spiritual wholeness that lives within every one of us, that core self, the soul, some people will call it, knows what justice feels like and has intense feelings in response to injustice. That true self knows the shape of justice and feels awful when it knows it is part of injustice. There's a teacher of conflict studies, international peace-building consultant, and professor at Eastern Mennonite University, where there's an internationally renowned school for conflict and peace studies. John Paul Lederach is his name. And he's a Mennonite and says this. He says, over the years, I have come to intuit more than scientifically prove, to feel more than quantify, that the center of building sustainable justice and peace is the quality and nature of people's relationships. And he says that he came to that understanding by watching spiders. He used to describe his model of peace building as a pyramid. He would talk about the middle out approach, which he stopped using because it confused everyone. But you need to understand it a little bit to get where he goes. So he has a pyramid, and at the top are those who make decisions in the society, who make the high-level negotiations and can form policies and so on. And then, of course, at the bottom are the grassroots, the people who are living the outcome of those decisions. And he said that in the world of peace building, you have folks who talk about a top-down approach where you just really need to get those top high-level players on board and they'll make it happen. And those who believe in a bottom-up approach, the grassroots, that you need to build a movement to make the peace building work. And he had articulated what he said was a middle-out approach, that really what you needed to look for were those in the middle who would connect these different layers, these different parts of the society. You needed people who were vertical integrators, who would go up and down between those high-level decision makers and the grassroots, who were trusted in both contexts. And you needed horizontal integrators, those who would connect parts of the society, different factions that mostly did not interact or meet with one another at all. So it's that middle out. But as he watched spiders, he began to draw a web. You can imagine a pyramid with that middle out diagram and lines going everywhere, turning into a web. He said, start with just watching how a spider weaves. It begins by becoming aware of the space it's in, by imagining what anchor points will be most secure for its web. Begins to weave a few connections, a loose star crossing over in a central hub. And then it proceeds to move into an outer circle to build a frame around and then to strengthen the hub in the middle. So the circle at the outside and the circle at the inside hold the frame of the web. And then because the goal is for this web to be able to take a blow without it breaking the whole thing apart, the spider goes back and forth, making many radii and building an interconnected structure, but one which has independent parts. Localized independence and a global interdependence. The goal, he says, is coordination without centralization. Last, to reinforce this, the spider moves outward in those auxiliary spirals that make those concentric rings holding the web together. And what Lederach and others, including this philosopher David Abram, have noticed is that scientists would talk about spiders as if they would do all of this by rote, as if it was just genetic code that they were acting on. This is probably how most of us think about spiders. They're just They're just operating like little machines, little programs to do the program that was coded in their DNA. But this is David Abram now. He said that they don't operate actually in that machine-like way. They are creative. They are generative beings. He said whatever instructions are enfolded within the living genome, they can hardly predict the specifics of the micro-terrain within which the spider may find itself at any particular moment. They could hardly have determined in advance the exact distance between the cave wall and the branch that the spider is now employing as an anchorage point for her current web, or the exact strength of the monsoon rains that make web spinning a bit more difficult on this evening. And so the genome could not explicitly have commanded the order of every flexion and extension of her various limbs as she weaves this web into place. However complex are the inherited programs, patterns, or predispositions, they must still be adapted to the immediate situation in which the spider finds itself. However determinate one's genetic inheritance, or cultural inheritance, I might add, it must still, as it were, be woven into the present, an activity that necessarily involves both a receptivity to the specific shapes and textures of that present, and a spontaneous creativity in adjusting one's self and one's inheritance to those contours. I know that's a lot. I'm going to read that last sentence again. However determinate one's inheritance, it must still be woven into the present, an activity that necessarily both involves a receptivity to the specific shapes and textures of that present, and a spontaneous creativity in adjusting oneself and one's inheritance to those contours. I think I should confess at this point that I really don't like spiders. Anyone in my family will tell you I have rather severe arachnophobia. I've found myself flailing at them, hanging out next to me in the car when I discover one, and it's not really safe, but I can't help it. But one dark night of the soul, I found myself laying on the floor of a round yurt. And I was blown open that night by finding my own wound of holding responsibility for all the pain of the world, trying to be good with all the inheritance of being a white guy in this society. I found it reflected in a young man who I was working with, who had shut down to the group and was no longer communicating, wouldn't verbally respond. I was really worried about him. I saw my own experiences of psychosis in him, and I saw him holding tightly this clothespin that I knew was a symbol from the Camp Anytown that he had just gone to, where they teach about the dynamics of oppression and diversity and how to build peace. I saw him holding on tightly to that clothespin, and for me it had come to symbolize this burden of responsibility, taking on more than I thought was his fair share, more than I really thought was my own fair share. I wanted him to know, I wanted my own teenage self to know that I was not alone, that it was not mine to carry alone this burden of racial injustice. And in attempting to free him of that burden, I did him harm. And now I was reeling and I was laying on the floor, and for hours as my mind found itself starting to wander into another period of psychosis, I stared up and watched a spider weaving its web on that ceiling of the yurt, and thought about these webs we weave. Our lives are organized and orchestrated by systems of justice making which remain largely invisible to us. What I was doing down there, sleeping in that hammock in Brazil, was studying restorative justice, and the teacher I studied with talked about how these systems of justice, they show up in the schools that we go to and in the families that we live in, and those largest scale systems end up internalized in our own beings. We recreate them in our thoughts, in the patterns of our hearts. We bring the web of justice that we live in into our own being. And what that teacher taught me, and what Lederach points to, and what Abram was starting to pick out, is that the web's strength comes from the places where it intersects, from those places where that in that middle out idea, the people who connect different parts of the web. And so this is the question I want to invite you into. Where do you intersect with difference in your life? Where are the places? Who are the people? What are the organizations where you are in contact with some other part of the web? And what might it look like as an individual, or maybe as us collectively? What would it look like to give more attention to those intersections? Might there be some creative potential waiting for you there? Because the true self knows what justice feels like, the way a spider knows how to weave a web. Not fully programmed, not knowing just how in every circumstance it will best be, but with the right instincts. And when we find those points of connection, we can build a more loving, a more just, a more beautiful web. This is what happened in Atlanta between the King family and the Unitarian Church there. So I want to read you another letter. This one, shortly after Dr. King's death, written by Coretta Scott King to the pastor there, Eugene Pickett, who became the Unitarian Universalist Association president later. Coretta said, "Please convey to the members of your congregation my deepest appreciation for their help at the time of my husband's death. Their concern and sympathy were demonstrated in many ways and made a tragic and confused period less trying for my family and me. It would have been impossible to provide for the many visitors in my home without the generosity of the members of the Atlanta Unitarian Church. The food, transportation, and lodging which they provided will be remembered as a tangible demonstration of the brotherhood in action which the Unitarian Church has always stressed. Opening, sorting, and handling the tremendous amount of mail sent to my children and me would truly have been an insurmountable task without the help of the people who responded to the Unitarian Church's appeal. Through the years, the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Atlanta has been a leader in bridging the gap between the white and black communities. My family and I will always remember how warmly and willingly you extended friendship and love during our most difficult hour. Please know that we will always be grateful. Sincerely yours, Coretta Scott King. There is a balm in Gilead to make the wounded whole. There is a balm in Gilead to heal the sin-sick soul. May we be courageous and curious and creative enough to weave such a healing web. May it be so.